Bumpy Johnson watched Slick Donovan steal his empire piece by piece for 18 months and let him, while Slick built his network, bribed his allies, and moved in for the final takeover. Bumpy was quietly turning every single move against him. What did Bumpy do that made Slick walk straight into a trap he had spent 18 months constructing with his own hands? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. The morning arrived the way all dangerous mornings do, quietly, without warning, dressed in the ordinary clothes of just another day. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Harlem when Calvin Reese, Bumpy Johnson's most trusted logistics man, pushed open the door to the warehouse on 131st Street and stopped cold. The loading dock was empty. Not just empty, stripped. The crates, the pallets, the carefully wrapped packages that represented months of planning and the largest single shipment Bumpy's operation had ever moved, all of it was gone. Not a splinter of wood, not a scrap of paper, not even the smell of the goods that should have filled that space wall to wall. Calvin stood there for a long moment, his hand still on the doorframe, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him. He walked the length of the warehouse once, then again, as if the crates might somehow be hiding behind shadows. Then he picked up the telephone on the far wall and dialed with a hand that would not stop trembling. Bumpy Johnson answered on the second ring. He listened without a word as Calvin explained. The shipment, every last piece of it, had been moved overnight. The locks had not been forced. The windows had not been broken. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of any violence. Nothing to suggest that anyone had entered that warehouse against the will of the people who controlled it. Whoever had come through that door had used a key. Whoever had redirected that shipment had known exactly where it was going, exactly how it was packaged, and exactly which routes it was supposed to travel. And then Calvin said the thing that made the air in the room change. "Boss," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "The delivery was made. The whole thing. It went out last night. Right on schedule. The paperwork was signed. The drivers were paid. Every step of the chain was followed exactly like you set it up. Except the address on the final invoice, it wasn't yours. Someone changed it. Someone used your name, your seal, your contacts, your entire system, and had everything delivered to a different man entirely." Bumpy said nothing for a moment. The silence on his end of the line was not the silence of shock. It was something colder and more deliberate than that. "Come to me," he said finally. "Tell no one else." He hung up the telephone, walked to the window of his apartment, and looked out over the streets of Harlem that he had spent the better part of 2 decades building into something that belonged to him. The early light was spreading across the rooftops, orange and gold, indifferent to the fact that somewhere beneath it, someone had just committed the most audacious act of betrayal this neighborhood had ever seen. Someone had not merely stolen from Bumpy Johnson. Someone had used him as the instrument of their own ambition. They had worn his name like a coat, walked through every door his reputation had opened, and then walked away with everything inside. Bumpy stood at the window for a long time. He did not call his enforcers. He did not reach for any weapon. He simply thought the way a chess player thinks when the board has just revealed something unexpected. Not with panic, but with the slow, careful rotation of every possible move and countermove through a mind that had been trained by hard years to stay perfectly still, precisely when everything around it was screaming for action. Because Bumpy Johnson had not built what he built by being the loudest man in the room. He had built it by being the one who understood the room better than anyone else in it, to understand what made that morning so significant. You have to go back to a rainy evening 7 years earlier, when a young Irish kid from the docks named Raymond Donovan first walked into Bumpy's presence and tried, with a great deal of audacity and very little wisdom, to negotiate a deal he had no leverage to make. The kid had come recommended by a port worker Bumpy trusted, and that single fact was the only reason the meeting happened at all. Raymond, who had already started calling himself Slick, a name that suited him the way a well-cut jacket suits a man who knows he's being watched, was 24 years old, lean and sharp-faced, with pale green eyes that moved around a room the way a card player's eyes move across a table. He was clever in the way that young men who grow up with nothing and survive by reading people are clever fast. Adaptive, always calculating the angle. What he lacked was depth. What he lacked was patience. What he lacked, on that particular evening, was any real understanding of who he was sitting across from. He made his pitch quickly, nervously, his words tumbling over each other with the barely contained energy of someone who had rehearsed too much and was now abandoning the script. He wanted in. He had connections at the docks. He said. He knew which inspectors could be reasoned with, which shipping routes were being watched, which ones were not. He could move things that other people couldn't move. All he needed was a partner with the infrastructure and the reach that he didn't have yet. Bumpy had listened to the entire speech without expression. When it was over, he asked exactly one question. Why should I trust a man I don't know? Slick had opened his mouth, ready with another prepared answer, and then stopped. Something in the way the question was delivered, not challenging, not hostile, simply direct in a way that cut straight through everything else, made him realize that a rehearsed answer would be the wrong answer. He closed his mouth. He thought about it honestly. And then he said, "You shouldn't. Not yet. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to make it worth your while to start." That answer, the honesty of it, the self-awareness of it was what made Bumpy decide. Not the connections at the docks, not the knowledge of shipping routes, not any of the practical value the young man was offering. It was the fact that when pushed to the edge of pretense, he had chosen truth. That was rare. In a world where everyone performed their loyalty while quietly calculating their exit, genuine candor was a currency more valuable than almost anything else. Bumpy brought him in, slowly at first, small assignments, short chains, nothing that would cost much if the trust turned out to be misplaced. But Slick delivered, every time, without fail, with a consistency and a precision that gradually expanded the boundaries of what Bumpy was willing to give him. Over the years that followed, Slick became something that very few people in Bumpy's world ever became genuinely useful. Not just as a worker, but as a mind. He understood logistics the way musicians understand rhythm intuitively, in his bones. He could look at a supply chain and see the weaknesses and the opportunities the way other men look at a map and see roads. Bumpy had taught him, that was the part that sat heaviest now, standing at that window, watching the morning light move across his city. He had not merely hired Slick Donovan. He had educated him. He had shown him how the architecture of power was built, brick by careful brick. He had explained the philosophy behind the structure, why certain decisions were made, why certain relationships were maintained, why patience was always worth more than speed. He had, in the most complete sense of the word, made the man, and the man had used everything he was given to build a door out. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Harlem's Underworld would ever know about, because it was conducted entirely in silence. Bumpy did not call meetings. He did not ask questions that could be traced back to him. He did not reach out to anyone in his inner circle in any way that deviated from the ordinary rhythms of business. To the outside world, and more importantly, to Slick, everything continued exactly as it always had. Bumpy was present where he was supposed to be present. He said the things he was supposed to say. He smiled when smiling was appropriate and was serious when seriousness was called for. He was, to every observer, entirely himself. But underneath that surface, something else was moving. He began with the drivers. Not by approaching them directly that would have sent a signal, but by having a man he trusted absolutely. A quiet figure named Thomas who had worked the edges of Bumpy's network for years without ever drawing attention. Begin asking the kinds of casual questions that workers ask each other. About routes, about schedules, about whether anyone had been asked to make a small adjustment here or there, a slight deviation from the standard procedure. Just this once, for a little extra at the end of the week. The answers came back in pieces, slowly, over the course of weeks, like a mosaic assembling itself, tile by tile. Then he worked outward from the drivers to the middlemen, and from the middlemen to the contact points, and from the contact points to the communication channels, and everywhere he looked, the same invisible hand had been at work. It was subtle, extraordinarily subtle, with the patience and precision of someone who understood the system from the inside. Small redirections, minor adjustments, nothing large enough to trigger alarm on its own. But when you laid every piece next to every other piece and stepped back to look at the whole picture, the shape that emerged was unmistakable. Someone had been building a parallel structure inside his organization, not destroying what he had that would have been crude, obvious, the move of someone who wanted chaos. This was something far more sophisticated. Someone had been quietly duplicating his network, contact by contact, route by route, relationship by relationship, with the intention not of tearing down what Bumpy had built, but of simply stepping into it and renaming it. The plan, when Bumpy could see all of it, was breathtaking in its ambition. Whoever had done this had not wanted to fight him. They had wanted to replace him so completely and so smoothly that Harlem might barely notice the difference until it was already done. The name that sat at the center of every thread he pulled was one he had already known it would be: Slick Donovan. There is a particular kind of pain that has no name in most languages. The pain that comes not from an enemy's betrayal, but from the betrayal of someone you chose, someone you invested in, someone whose capacity for this exact thing you trained without knowing you were training it. Bumpy felt that pain in the days that followed his discovery, though he felt it the way he felt most difficult things quietly. In private, in the hours before dawn when the city was still and there was no performance required of him. He allowed himself those hours. He did not allow himself anything beyond them, because the question before him was not emotional, it was strategic, and it required his clearest thinking. He could have moved immediately. He had enough by the end of the third week to confirm everything with certainty. He knew who. He knew how. He knew most of the why. But moving immediately would have been the obvious response. And obvious responses, Bumpy had learned long ago, almost never produced the best outcomes. Slick knew he had taken a risk. Slick would be watching for exactly the kind of reaction that an immediate move represented. He would have contingencies prepared. He would have exit routes planned. He would be braced for the storm. What he would not be braced for was nothing. So Bumpy gave him nothing. He continued life as normal. He continued treating Slick with the same warmth and professional regard he always had. He continued including him in meetings, asking his opinion, giving him work that mattered. And all the while he watched now not to confirm what he already knew, but to map the full extent of what was being built against him. Every week that passed without consequence gave Slick more confidence. Every week of confidence made him bolder. Every act of boldness revealed more of the structure, more of the allies, more of the plan. Bumpy was not waiting for the right moment to react. He was conducting the most patient and deliberate operation of his career, using Slick's own sense of security as the instrument by which Slick would eventually, completely, and irreversibly expose himself. The dinner was Bumpy's idea, as most things in that season were. He chose a small restaurant on Lenox Avenue that he had been eating at for 15 years, a place where the owner knew him well enough to give him the back corner table without being asked, and where the ambient sound of other conversations created enough privacy for anything that needed to be said between two people who understood the value of discretion. He invited Slick with the ease of a man who had nothing on his mind but a good meal and the company of someone he respected. Slick accepted with the ease of a man who believed he was not yet in danger. They ate well. They talked about business, the surface-level business, the kind of conversation that had filled dozens of evenings between them over the years. Slick was relaxed, funny, attentive, everything that had made him such good company from the beginning. Watching him, Bumpy thought about what it meant to be truly gifted at performance. The man across the table from him was executing a role with skill that deserved, in some other world, genuine admiration. Then Bumpy set down his fork, touched the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and said, in the tone of a man sharing something mildly interesting that had crossed his mind, "You know, I've been thinking about an old story lately, about an eagle." Slick looked at him with the politely curious expression of someone prepared to engage with whatever came next. "There was an eagle," Bumpy said, "who found an injured snake on a mountain path. Young eagle, big heart. He carried the snake back to his nest, fed it, kept it warm, taught it which winds to ride and which to avoid. The snake was grateful, or seemed to be. It learned everything. Over time, it grew strong. And then, when it was strong enough, it began very slowly, very quietly to redirect the food that came into the nest. Not all at once. Just a little. Just enough that the eagle wouldn't notice right away." Slick's expression had not changed. His eyes had not moved. But something in the air between them shifted by a degree that only a man paying very close attention would have been able to measure. "The snake had a plan," Bumpy continued, "a careful plan, a patient plan, something that showed real intelligence, real understanding of how the nest worked. Because of course it had been taught by the best teacher available." He paused. He lifted his glass, turned it slowly between his fingers. "What's interesting," he said, "is that the eagle knew. Not at the end, not when the snake thought it was almost finished. The eagle knew from very near the beginning. The interesting part is that the snake had no idea." The silence at the table was total. Around them, the restaurant continued its ordinary noise. But at that corner table, something had stopped moving entirely. Slick's face was very still. His hands, which had been resting on the table, were now invisible beneath it. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way that a voice becomes careful when its owner is deciding very quickly what kind of danger they are in. "That's quite a story," he said. Bumpy looked at him. The look lasted exactly long enough. Then he smiled a warm, unhurried smile and placed his hand briefly on Slick's shoulder as he rose from the table. "It is," he agreed pleasantly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. Raymond." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, and the night air of Harlem received him with the familiar smell of the city. He owned the city that, at that moment, still did not know what was coming. Slick sat alone at the table for a long time after he left. His mind was moving fast, running through everything, calculating what had been said and what had been implied, and what it meant for the timeline he had been building so carefully. He told himself it was a warning. He told himself Bumpy was sending a message, testing him, seeing if he would flinch. He told himself the smart move was to accelerate to strike before whatever Bumpy was preparing could be fully assembled. He told himself all of this, and he believed it, because believing it was the only alternative to accepting something far more frightening, that he was not playing the game he thought he was playing, that he had never been playing the game he thought he was playing, and that the man who had just walked calmly into the Harlem night had not been warning him at all. He had been watching him make his final mistake. The morning after the dinner on Lenox Avenue, Slick Donovan woke before dawn and lay in the darkness of his apartment with his eyes open and his mind already moving at full speed. He was not a man who frightened easily. That quality, the ability to hold steady when pressure was applied, was one of the things that had made him valuable in the first place. But what had happened at that corner table the previous evening was not the kind of thing that could be processed quickly and filed away. The story about the eagle, the pause before the punchline, the way Bumpy had looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something that was almost tender, the way a surgeon looks at a patient just before making the first incision. Slick had turned it over 100 times in the hours since, and every angle he examined it from produced the same uncomfortable conclusion. Bumpy knew something. The only variable was how much. By the time the city outside his window began its slow transformation from night to early morning, he had made his decision. The window was narrowing. The only intelligent response to a narrowing window was to move through it before it closed entirely, and to move faster than the person on the other side expected. He made 3 phone calls before he left his apartment. The first went to a man named Caruso, not the head of the Moretti family, but close enough to the center of their operations that speaking to him was functionally equivalent to speaking to the organization. Slick had been building this relationship for 8 careful months, feeding the Italians precisely calibrated information about Bumpy's network, enough to establish his own credibility and usefulness, not enough to give them anything they could act on independently. Now he compressed the timeline. He told Caruso that conditions in Harlem were shifting faster than anticipated, that Bumpy Johnson was showing signs of losing his hold on the operation, that key figures inside the network were quietly looking for new allegiances, that the moment both of them had been positioning for was closer than either had originally projected. Caruso listened to all of it, then asked one question. How soon? Weeks, Slick said, not months. The second and third calls went to 2 men who had been inside Bumpy's organization for years. Men Slick had been compensating generously for intelligence. Men whose carefully maintained positions had given him access to the internal rhythms of an operation he was preparing to absorb. He told them both the same thing: accelerate. He needed more information. Compiled, faster. Names, schedules, locations, asset valuations. If the final move was coming in weeks, he needed a complete and current picture of everything that was about to change hands. What Slick did not know, what he had no mechanism for knowing, was that both of those men had walked directly to Bumpy Johnson within 2 days of being first approached, months earlier, and that every piece of intelligence they had delivered to Slick since that moment had been reviewed, adjusted, and in several critical instances, entirely constructed by the man Slick believed he was outmaneuvering. Every careful assessment Slick had made of Bumpy's vulnerabilities had been made using information that Bumpy himself had designed for that exact purpose. He had been reading a map that his enemy had drawn for him. The offensive that followed was visible enough that people on the outer edges of Harlem's underground began to take notice, which was precisely what Slick intended. Confidence, in that world, was its own form of communication. A man who moved openly was a man who believed he had already won. And that belief was contagious. It pulled other people toward him. People who wanted to be on the right side of what was coming. People who understood that in a power transition, the most dangerous position was neutrality. Slick moved with the energy of a man who had spent a long time preparing for a single moment and could finally feel it arriving. The rumors about Bumpy began appearing in exactly the places where consequential rumors always incubate, in the back corners of establishments, where business was conducted informally, in the margins of transactions, in the cautious lateral conversations of people trying to read the direction of change before committing to a position. The narrative was consistent across its many variations. Bumpy Johnson was losing his grip. He was distracted, possibly dealing with pressures that were pulling his focus away from the daily management of his operation. The structure was running on its own momentum rather than on active leadership. The opportunity for someone with the right positioning and the right backing was opening up, and it would not remain open indefinitely. Within 2 weeks, 3 of Bumpy's most visible operations went quiet simultaneously. A numbers operation on 125th Street closed without explanation. A distribution point near the park stopped receiving traffic. A meeting location that had functioned as neutral ground for years was suddenly unavailable. Its doors locked and its regular visitors left without a venue or an explanation. The men associated with those locations either disappeared entirely from their usual routines or reappeared looking uncertain, disconnected from any clear chain of command. To anyone watching the surface of things, and Slick was watching the surface of things with intense, focused attention, it read as the beginning of an unraveling. It read as a man losing control of something too large and too complex to hold together without the concentrated force of his full attention. Slick read it exactly as it was meant to be read. What he could not see, because his investment in his own narrative had made him partially blind to alternatives, was that every operation that had gone quiet had done so on direct instruction from Bumpy, that every rumor had been seeded deliberately into the channels Slick was monitoring, and that every man who had vacated a visible position had been reassigned, cleanly, completely, without any disruption to the actual functioning of the network, to positions that existed below the level of visibility that Slick's intelligence could reach. Bumpy was not losing control. He was performing the loss of control with the precision of a master dramatist who understood that the most effective theater is the kind the audience believes is reality. He was also doing something more strategically significant than merely creating a convincing illusion. He was removing from Slick's potential reach every asset that could be legitimately targeted, pulling them back behind layers of the operation that Slick had never been given access to, the deeper architecture, the relationships and arrangements that predated Slick's involvement and had never been brought into any room where he stood. What remained visible was essentially a shell, authentic in its surface details, accurate enough in its general outlines to pass examination, but hollowed of everything that actually mattered. Slick was preparing to take over an empire. What he was actually preparing to take over was a stage set. The offer arrived through Caruso, which was how it had been designed to arrive, because receiving it through a channel he had built himself would make it feel like a product of his own work rather than someone else's construction. A new distribution partner operating out of the Northeast. The message said a well-capitalized organization with serious ambitions and an interest in consolidating the Harlem network under a single new management structure. The terms were exceptional in their specificity and their generosity. Full acquisition of every remaining independent operation. Documented transfer of all supply chain relationships and established routes. A substantial cash settlement upon completion. The only requirement, presented as a standard due diligence measure, was that Slick provide a comprehensive accounting of the network he controlled contacts, routes, financial records, asset locations, the complete infrastructure, and facilitate a single demonstration delivery to establish operational credibility before the final transaction was completed. It was in every detail, exactly the offer that a man in Slick's position, at this precise moment in his campaign, would have been waiting for. It arrived at the moment when his confidence was highest and his critical judgment most likely to be overridden by the momentum of events. It was generous enough to be credible, specific enough to feel serious, and structured in a way that made every request seem like ordinary commercial procedure rather than an extraordinarily sophisticated extraction of intelligence. He accepted within 24 hours, because of course he did. The preparation phase that followed consumed 3 intense weeks. Slick compiled the documentation with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the quality of his presentation would determine the quality of his outcome. He organized his contacts by function and geography. He mapped every route with the detail of someone who had spent 18 months building those routes from scratch. He documented his financial transactions, identified his supply sources, listed every insider relationship he had cultivated within what had been Bumpy's organization. He cross-referenced everything, created multiple copies, verified every figure against his records. It was, when finished, the most complete and accurate account of an underground operation that had ever been assembled in a single document. He handed it over with the satisfaction of a craftsman presenting his finest work. The night of the delivery arrived cold and still, the kind of late autumn night in Harlem when the streets seem to hold their breath, when sound carries farther than usual and shadows have sharper edges than they do in warmer seasons. Slick reached the warehouse at the appointed hour, with 6 men he trusted, and the particular internal calm that comes from standing at the threshold of a moment you have been building toward for a long time. The trucks were already positioned. The buyers were present, composed and professional. Everything was in alignment, running with a smoothness that felt like confirmation. For the first 40 minutes, it was everything he had imagined. The cargo moved efficiently, the paperwork processed without friction. The buyer's representative, a well-dressed, unhurried man named Edwards, whom Slick had met twice during the negotiation, supervised the transfer, with the quiet authority of someone entirely at ease with the mechanics of large transactions. Slick watched it all and felt the long tension of the past months begin, at last, to release. This was the pivot point. Everything before this had been preparation. Everything after would be consolidation. Then a small, almost negligible detail snagged his attention. A gesture. The buyer's representative touched the left lapel of his jacket in a particular way, a habitual, unconscious movement. The kind of physical tic that belongs to a specific person and is entirely invisible unless you have seen it before in a different context. Slick had seen it before. He stood very still for a moment, refusing to let his mind complete the connection it was trying to make. Then he looked at the driver of the nearest truck. He looked at the man standing at the end of the dock. He looked at the 2 figures near the loading door. He looked back at Edwards. He knew all of them, not from the world of this transaction, not from the network he was acquiring, but from years of meetings and operations inside an organization he had spent 18 months working to replace. Every person in that warehouse was connected, in ways that were now clicking into place with horrible clarity. To Bumpy Johnson. The understanding arrived not gradually but all at once, a complete picture assembling itself in a single second with the specific brutality of a truth that has been waiting a long time for the right moment to make itself known. The new partner did not exist. The offer had never been real. The documentation he had compiled so carefully and handed over so confidently was now in Bumpy's possession. Every contact, every route, every financial record, every name. The money he had committed to this transaction was gone. The demonstration of operational capability he had just performed had demonstrated, with comprehensive precision, everything he had built and everyone who was part of it. He had not been executing his plan. He had been executing a plan that had been designed for him by the man he was trying to destroy, for the express purpose of receiving exactly what he had just delivered. Edward straightened his jacket, looked at Slick with the neutral professionalism of a man completing an assigned task, and said quietly, "Mr. Johnson appreciates your thoroughness." Then he went back to supervising the transfer. and the warehouse continued its efficient activity around Slick as he stood in the center of it, unable to move, understanding for the first time the true scale of what had been built around him. The Italian alliance collapsed 3 days later, with a speed that would have been remarkable if Bumpy had relied on pressure or negotiation to produce it. He relied on neither. He requested a private meeting with Marco Moretti directly, no intermediaries, no advance explanation of purpose, simply a direct and respectful request from one established figure to another. Moretti agreed, because the kind of man who built what Bumpy Johnson had built did not request face-to-face meetings without something that warranted the formality, and because declining such a request carried its own set of implications. Bumpy came alone to a private room above a restaurant in the Bronx and sat across from Moretti with a folder between them on the table. He did not open it immediately. He said, "Before I show you what's in here, I want to be clear about why I'm here. I'm not here to make demands or issue ultimatums. I'm here because I think two men who have always been straight with each other deserve to know when someone has been crooked with both of them at the same time." He opened the folder. The documents inside traced every payment Slick had made to individuals within the Moretti organization's lower tiers, not payments for services, not standard business transactions, but payments for influence and misdirection. Payments made with funds that included capital the Moretti family had invested in Slick's expansion, used specifically to bribe the Moretti's own people into making decisions that served Slick's interests at the Moretti's direct expense. Slick had not merely played two sides. He had built a circular mechanism in which one side's resources were used to corrupt the other side in order to benefit himself. A structure so layered in its deception that it required a diagram to fully comprehend. Bumpy provided the diagram. Moretti studied it without speaking for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had passed through anger and arrived somewhere on the other side of it at the cold, permanent place where men like him made decisions they would not revisit. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "Long enough to verify every piece of it," Bumpy said, "and you're bringing it to me now because it's yours," Bumpy said. "Because you have a right to know what was done with your confidence and your resources, and because I believe that what we've built between us over the years is worth more than whatever he was trying to build between us and against us." Moretti was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded a single, deliberate movement that contained within it a complete decision. "I'll handle my side of this," he said. "I know," Bumpy said. He stood, extended his hand, and Moretti shook it with the grip of a man honoring an agreement. The meeting was over in less than 30 minutes. By the following morning, every channel the Italian alliance had opened for Slick had not merely closed, they had sealed, with people on the inside who were no longer passive but actively motivated, hunting the man they had recently been supporting with the particular energy of those who feel they have been made to look foolish. Slick went from having powerful allies to being actively pursued by them in the span of a single night, without a single act of force from Bumpy's direction. The final meeting took place in Bumpy's office on an overcast afternoon, in a room where the gray light came through the windows without warmth, and the city below moved with the quiet purposefulness of people who had no idea what was being concluded in the room above them. Slick came because the alternative was worse than coming. He sat across the desk from Bumpy Johnson and looked at what was laid out between them, page after page of documentation. Photographs, financial records, transcripts of conversations he had conducted in locations he had considered secure. A complete and perfectly organized record of everything he had done across 18 months, assembled with a calm and unhurried thoroughness that communicated, more powerfully than any accusation could, how entirely the situation had been controlled. His hands were not steady. He kept them below the desk where they could not be seen. "How long?" he asked finally, because it was the only question that still mattered. "How long did you actually know?" Bumpy looked at him with an expression that contained no anger and no triumph, only the level, considered attention of a man who has thought carefully about what he is about to say, and has decided to say it honestly. "From the beginning," he said, "from the first route adjustment you made without explanation, that was the first signal." Slick stared at him in silence. "I let it develop," Bumpy continued, his voice carrying the unhurried quality of a man with nothing left to prove. "Because I needed to understand the full scope of what you were building. I needed every connection mapped, every ally identified, every asset documented. You did that work for me, Raymond. Every step you took forward gave me more information than the step before it. Every risk you took was a risk I had already prepared for. The insiders you were paying were reporting to me. The intelligence they gave you was shaped by me. The offer that brought everything together was constructed by my people and delivered through your channel so it would feel like your own success." He explained it all: the drivers and Thomas, the false intelligence, the warehouse operation, the meeting with Moretti. He laid out each component in sequence, not to humiliate but to inform, with the pedagogical patience of a man who believes that understanding is something owed regardless of the circumstances that surround it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Slick sat with everything he had just heard settling into its final shape, the complete picture of his own defeat assembling itself around him with a terrible and irreversible clarity. He had believed he was the architect of events. He had been, from nearly the beginning, a character in someone else's story. Every choice that had felt like strategy had been a response. Every step forward had been anticipated. The entire 18-month operation that he had built with such care and patience and intelligence had been, in its most essential nature, a mechanism for delivering himself. He looked at Bumpy Johnson across the desk and asked the only question he had remaining. "What happens now? What are you going to do with me?" Bumpy turned his chair slowly toward the window. He looked down at Harlem, the streets below, the people moving through them with the ordinary urgency of lives being lived, the neighborhood that had been the reason for everything, the weight that gave every calculation its meaning. He was silent for a long time, long enough that the silence became a presence in the room, something with shape and temperature. And then he told Slick exactly what was going to happen. It was not what Slick had been steeling himself to hear. It was not the violent resolution that the architecture of their world had always made available as an option. Not the direct and forceful punishment that Slick had been mentally rehearsing a response to since he first understood that the walls had closed around him. What Bumpy described was something quieter and more precise. And as Slick listened, the blood moving through him went cold in a way that no physical threat had ever managed to produce, because he understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his life inside the machinery of reputation and trust, that what Bumpy was describing was not a punishment he could survive and recover from. It was the kind of ending that left nothing behind worth surviving for. What Bumpy described to Slick that afternoon was not a sentence handed down from a position of rage. It was something delivered in the same measured, unhurried tone that had characterized every word Bumpy had spoken across the entire length of that conversation, the tone of a man who has thought carefully about consequences and has chosen the one that fits most precisely. The way a craftsman chooses the right tool, not because it is the heaviest, but because it is the most exact. He was going to let Slick leave. He was going to let him walk out of that office, out of the building, out of Harlem, and go wherever he chose to go. There would be no physical restraint, no formal punishment in any traditional sense of the word. The door was open. The city was wide. Slick was free to use both. But before he left, Bumpy told him, every person in the underground world who mattered, every operator, every distributor, Every family with interests that extended into the kind of commerce that did not appear in any public ledger would receive a communication, not a threat, not a demand for action against Slick, simply information, delivered with the same quiet precision that had characterized everything Bumpy had done across the past 18 months. The full account what Slick had done, how he had done it, the names he had compromised, the trust he had exploited, the methods he had used to deceive the people who had taken him in on both sides of the arrangement. Every detail, documented and verified, passed along through channels that reached every corner of a world where reputation was the only currency that could not be counterfeited. Slick sat with that for a moment. He understood it immediately and completely, because he had spent his entire adult life inside a system where the mechanics of reputation were as real and as consequential as any physical force. In the legitimate world, a man could reinvent himself, change cities, change names, change the story he told about who he was and where he came from, in the world they both inhabited. That option did not exist. Reputation moved faster than any man could travel. It arrived at the next city before he did. It sat at the table before he walked through the door. And a reputation built on the specific combination of betrayal, manipulation, and the exploitation of extended trust that was not a stain that faded with time or distance. That was a mark that the world they lived in never forgot and never forgave, because the entire architecture of that world rested on the premise that certain commitments, once made, were absolute. Slick would not be imprisoned. He would be made invisible. No one would work with him. No one would vouch for him. No one would extend credit, offer partnership, or accept his presence at any table where serious business was conducted. He would move through a world that had known his name and would continue to know it, but would turn its back whenever he appeared. Not out of hostility, but out of the simple, devastating calculus of self-preservation. Associating with a man who had done what he had done was a risk no rational operator would accept. He would spend the rest of his life knocking on doors that would never open, in city after city, until the knocking itself became a kind of madness. He left Bumpy's office without another word. There was nothing left to say. He walked down the stairs and out onto the street and into a Harlem afternoon that looked exactly as it always had. And he understood, with a clarity that only arrives when every alternative has been removed, that the city he was walking through was no longer a place that contained him. He was already gone. He simply had not finished moving yet. The weeks that followed Slick's departure were not marked by any visible celebration in Bumpy's world, which was itself the clearest possible statement about the nature of what had just occurred. There were no announcements, no public demonstrations of restored authority, no theatrical reassertion of control over the operations that had been quietly maintained throughout the entire period of apparent decline. The operations that had gone dark simply became visible again, one by one, each resuming its function with the unremarkable continuity of something that had never truly stopped. The men who had been reassigned returned to their positions. The networks that had been pulled below visibility rose back to the surface. Harlem, from the inside, simply continued as if the storm had passed through without leaving the kind of wreckage that storms are supposed to leave. And Bumpy returned to the part of his life that had always been, for those who understood him fully, the truest expression of who he was. He was back on his regular corners before the month was out. Not the corners of power and transaction, but the corners of the neighborhood itself. The woman on 127th Street, who had been 3 months behind on her rent, received an envelope without a return address that covered everything she owed, and 2 months forward. The family on Lenox, whose eldest son had lost his job at the docks, found, through a quiet intermediary, that a position had been identified and arranged. The church that fed people on Sunday mornings received a delivery of supplies that arrived before sunrise, left by someone no one could identify, in quantities that would last through the winter. None of this was announced. None of it was performed for an audience. It was simply done. In the way that Bumpy had always done it, not as philanthropy in any formal sense, not as the calculated generosity of a powerful man managing his public image, but as the fulfillment of an obligation that he took as seriously as any other obligation in his life. Harlem had given him everything: the foundation, the loyalty, the human infrastructure of trust and connection, without which nothing he had built could have stood for a single day. The people of the neighborhood were not his subjects. They were, in the deepest sense he understood that word, his responsibility. Protecting his position in Harlem had never been about preserving his own comfort or his own authority. It had been about preserving the arrangement that allowed him to keep that responsibility intact. This was the thing that Slick had never understood, and it was the gap at the center of his entire miscalculation. He had looked at what Bumpy had built and seen a structure of power assets, roots, relationships, leverage. He had treated the human elements of that structure as components to be acquired or neutralized, inputs in an operational equation. He had never understood that for Bumpy. Those human elements were not the means to an end. They were the end itself. The operation existed to serve Harlem. Harlem did not exist to serve the operation. That inversion of priority was not a sentiment or a pose. It was the organizing principle of everything Bumpy had ever built. The reason the loyalty he commanded ran deeper than anything money or fear could purchase. And the reason that when he needed his network to hold through 18 months of deliberate misdirection and sustained pressure, it held without a single significant fracture. You cannot buy that kind of loyalty. You can only earn it, over years, through the consistent demonstration that the people who trust you are not wrong to do so. There is a lesson in what Bumpy Johnson did across those 18 months, and it is not a simple one. It is not the lesson of the man who fights back harder than he was hit, or the man who outspends or outmuscles his opponent into submission. Those are lessons about force, and force, as Bumpy understood better than almost anyone, is the tool of men who have run out of better options. The lesson is about something older and more demanding than force. It is about the discipline of not reacting, the specific and extraordinary self-control required to sit with knowledge that demands immediate action and choose instead to wait, to observe, to allow events to develop fully before determining the precise and irreversible moment to act. Most people, when they discover they have been betrayed, respond from the place where the pain is sharpest. The response feels necessary, even righteous, because the emotion driving it is real. But the response that feels most necessary in the moment of injury is almost never the response that produces the best outcome. It is loud where it should be quiet. It is fast where it should be slow. It closes off options that patience would have kept open, and it reveals the boundaries of what you know before you have finished learning everything there is to know. Bumpy waited because waiting gave him more than moving would have. Every day of apparent inaction was, in reality, a day of intelligence gathering, of structural preparation, of allowing his opponent to move deeper into a position from which there was no exit. He did not suppress his knowledge of the betrayal because he was uncertain about how to respond. He suppressed it because he understood that the full expression of what he knew, deployed at exactly the right moment, was worth incomparably more than the immediate satisfaction of a premature confrontation. And the man who finally sat across that desk and saw the complete record of his own undoing laid out in front of him understood, in that moment, something that Bumpy had understood from the very beginning, that the most dangerous opponent you will ever face is not the one who is stronger than you, or faster than you, or more ruthless than you. It is the one who is more patient than you, the one who can hold the full weight of what they know in perfect stillness, while the world around them moves and reacts and reveals itself. until the moment arrives, when everything is in exactly the right position, and then act with a precision that patience alone makes possible. Bumpy Johnson was never the most physically imposing figure in any room he entered. He was never the loudest voice or the most aggressive presence. What he was consistently, and without exception, was the most prepared, the most observant, the most willing to invest time in understanding a situation completely before committing to a response. In a world that rewarded speed and aggression, he had built his entire philosophy around the counterintuitive proposition that the man who understands most deeply will always, eventually, outlast the man who acts most quickly. Real power, in the end, is not the ability to make people afraid of what you might do. Fear is temporary. Fear is a calculation that changes when the balance of force changes. Real power is something that operates before fear ever becomes relevant. It is the quality that makes the people around you unwilling to contemplate betrayal in the first place, not because they are afraid of the consequences, but because they understand, at a level below calculation, that the man they are considering moving against sees further than they do, thinks longer than they do, and has almost certainly already accounted for the move they are only beginning to imagine. That is the lesson Harlem never had to be taught, because Harlem had lived it, and it is the lesson that Slick Donovan carried with him out of that city and into whatever diminished version of a life remained to him, not as wisdom he could use, but as the knowledge of what he had failed to understand until it was far too late to matter. Bumpy Johnson walked back into his neighborhood as the first cold days of winter arrived, and Harlem received him the way it always had, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, steady recognition of people who know who belongs among them. The streets continued their noise. The children continued their games on the sidewalks. The ordinary life of an extraordinary place went on, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the daily fabric of all that ordinary life, an envelope arrived, a door opened. A family sat down to a meal they had not been certain they could afford. That was his empire. That was what he had been protecting all along, and it was still standing.